welcome back to another episode of Drum Room Rescue, my series where I take you behind the scenes in the planning and design of my own remodeling project for my drum room / music room. In past episodes, we took a look at wall, flooring, and ceiling assemblies and some construction techniques to help with acoustic control for the space. We also took a look at some planning tools and some resources to help you in planning and executing your own project. We also looked at heating, ventilation, and air conditioning and sort of took a look at how important that comes, especially in the general approach of creating a very tightly constructed and air-sealed space. So today we're going to take a look at lighting. I think lighting is an interesting thing in that there is a tremendous amount of subjectivity, a lot to do with aesthetics, and then there's some pieces of it that kind of relate to some of the topics we've been looking at in terms of acoustic control. As you can see, in this room alone, there's all kinds of different lighting sources. Outside, we have natural daylight, free of charge during certain times of the day. Then we also have here in the room a number of types of lights. Right here above my kitchen table, this is a pendant type fixture. So this is hung obviously from the ceiling and has a light source. And above me, we also have recessed lights. These are lights that are at the ceiling level, but they are not exposed. The only thing you can really see is the actual bulb or light source itself. And then another type of light that you can have is a surface mounted light. And that can be any type of configuration or aesthetic or look, but typically that means that the light itself is connected to the ceiling and can be viewed and is not generally hung down like a pendant light like this. Not only are there a number of different light types, the individual light types can have their own light sources too. For example, here these pendants, this is an incandescent bulb, an old style bulb. And that's one type. Up here in the recessed lights, that's an LED or light emitting diode type. And in some of the surface mounted lights, you might still have what we call fluorescent lights, those long 4-foot tubes as a light source. Each one of these sources kind of has a different aesthetic, has a different light quality and the type of light it provides. And can be either beneficial to you in terms of planning the acoustic control associated with your space, or it can be a challenge and introduce some challenges. I think one of the things when I've done previous projects at my home, I really like the recessed type lights. But if you actually look at the recessed lights, they require creating a hole in your space. And that can really pose a challenge when you're looking at acoustic control and essentially trying to prevent the transmission of sound either into your space or out of your space. There's a couple of different approaches you can do to help mitigate that, but it's probably not the best choice for a space where the acoustic control becomes a focus. One of the challenges with the recessed light is actually being able to seal it. This is a website that's just a resource, you can search Google. And this website actually had 6 recommendations to how to soundproof recessed lighting. And I like 5 and 6. 5 says consider a different form of lighting, which means do something else. And 6 is essentially eliminating the hole that the recessed light would have. So I think recessed lighting presents some challenges to any approach. Probably a better approach in that situation is more of a pendant or a surface mounted light. And that really allows you to minimize the penetrations associated with the light fixture and to help mitigate some of that acoustic control. And so having a light down in the space and having a minimal penetration is probably going to give you better results in terms of acoustic control. But obviously in my space, you've seen some of the other videos, I'm sacrificing some headroom in order to build a separated ceiling. So the last thing I think I want is any sort of pendant type, just the idea to end up whacking my head on the thing. So I've been looking at some surface mounted lighting. And there's kind of a bunch of different types, but one of the types is like a troffer style, kind of your long linear shaped fixture. You can have some smaller round or square type surface mounted lights. Those give a nice even lighting throughout. They're kind of more of a diffuse lighting, and as well as you can have all kinds of different bulb types, if you will. And nowadays you can get different color temperatures for your lighting fixtures. And another type that you can do in terms of surface mounted is track lighting. I don't have any track lighting here in the house, but you're probably pretty familiar with track lighting. And what that actually does is give you a lot of flexibility in terms of the type of track heads you're using. There's actually several different types of track lighting systems, but in the end it gives you a lot of flexibility. I guess the downside is, depending on the actual type of fixture that you're using, it can be a very focused kind of spot type light. Think museum, or you're trying to accent some specific space. But also what comes up a lot in terms of lighting is a lot of things that we like to be able to do. And that is control them. Right now I'm using an app. All of my lighting in my house is networked. And also being able to dim the lights. So if I'm looking at these pendants here, I can actually go down and dim these lights to whatever level I want, as well as here with the recessed lights. What's interesting in some of the resources I've shown you, whether it's Rod Gervais's book or a couple of the other books that I shared, as well as some online resources, is that one of the big issues that comes up a lot is with dimming and radio frequency interference. And some of the challenges are with, if you have sort of the inexpensive slider switch type dimmers, that there could be some issues on the electrical system that can introduce noise into some of your recording equipment. I've never really ran into that problem in my drum room. I have kind of just a basic slider dimmer on the lighting I have in there. But it's probably not something I'm going to introduce, probably not going to integrate dimmers. What the suggestion is, instead of dimming, which is really obviously adjusting the light level, is just adding switches so that you can have a number of lights and have multiple switches. So if you need a lot of light, you can turn a lot of switches on. If you need less, you can turn them off. One of the things when I was looking into lighting, to be honest, there isn't a lot of information in some of the resources I shared. A lot of that has to focus on, the challenges with ceiling penetrations associated with lighting, as well as some of the issues with dimmers and radio frequency interference. But there isn't really, in terms of, this is a good way to light the space. I think what's interesting, I did a lot of research on websites, YouTube videos, and a lot of the lighting, the studio lighting, has nothing really to do with acoustic control or some of those issues. It really has to do with vibe, like how a place looks and how it feels. So what I did is I actually went, I was watching lots of videos. This is a good channel I really like, Andrew Masters. And he has this entire series where he goes to different music studios. And I watched a ton of them just to try to see what kind of lighting was there. And it's a whole myriad of different types of lighting. But really, I think it's interesting that lighting tends to be one of those things that's more, in this situation, kind of more about ambiance, trying to create a different vibe. And I think for my space, I want to keep it simple. I want to do some basic lighting design. And then down the road, if I want to add colored LEDs or something funky, I'll do that. And what seems to be very popular nowadays is strip LED type. And a lot of these strip systems have the ability to change colors or to flash or to give different types of effects. And this seems to be used a lot in sort of accent lighting, or behind coves or under desks or in the background. So it's interesting when I'm looking at my space, I'm kind of a straightforward guy, and really as a practice room, in my head, I'm thinking more about just having enough light to practice, to jam with people. and probably less thinking about sort of green LED washing the wall. So that stuff maybe I'll consider later or at another time. But for me right now, what I'm really looking at is fixture selection that gives me a good base level of light and that kind of minimizes penetrations and minimizes susceptibility to acoustic control issues. So here before you we have my drum space, and this will look familiar, but it's not SketchUp. In the last video series, we took a look at the SketchUp model I built for my project. This is actually a software called Revit. Revit is a planning and design software package. It's typically used in the architectural, engineering, and construction industry for the development of plans. And one of the reasons why I like it is it actually has an internal rendering engine that allows you to create photorealistic images, that allows you to test ideas and in some situations use manufacturers' data to get an idea of how something is going to look, especially in terms of lighting, before you decide on how you want to lay out and design your space. Now SketchUp can do renderings too. This is a list on a website that shows all the third-party plugins that can be used to do rendering in SketchUp. And I have done rendering in SketchUp before. I've actually used this program here called Shader Light. I'll show you briefly some work I did previously. This was a renovation that someone was planning in a kitchen. They were looking at different lighting that they could do. Use some images to help build a SketchUp model. We looked at a couple of different lights and we used manufacturer's data and incorporated it into our model. And this is SketchUp is a pretty good way to cleanly show concepts and test ideas and different layouts, different types of pendants, different types of layouts for the recessed lighting. And using that Shader Light plugin, we're able to do some renderings here and look at the different lighting levels with various situations, dimming, different configurations of lights being on and off. And it was a good way to kind of see and test ideas before you actually buy fixtures or start cutting it into drywall. Either tool, either SketchUp or something like Revit, can be used. In this situation, I've just decided to use Revit because it's a little bit cleaner and I already had built a model. So with this Revit tool, what's interesting with Revit is that you can incorporate manufacturers' data for lights into a space, as well as use some of the material information such as reflectivity and color, and generate some pretty interesting renderings that let you compare different lighting options, and you can gather some information that I'll go over in a little bit. So for example, this is Cooper Lighting Solutions, but they make a line Halo, which is very popular at like Home Depot, very basic, cost-effective lighting fixtures. Two that I was considering, two types of lighting fixtures. One was track lighting, which is, where basically this is a linear track. These are heads that can be moved along that track, and the tracks themselves come in lengths of 2, 4, 6, 8 feet. So they're very flexible, highly customizable. And this type of fixture, this is an LED fixture, so it's pretty small in terms of 14.8 watts, which is the power it uses. Lumens, that's actually the lighting intensity at the fixture, is up to 1100 lumens. And these LEDs, they're very long life. So 70% of lumen maintenance over 50,000 hours, that's a long time. And what's interesting is that you can get a whole bunch of different color temperatures. So this is basically a very warm light at 2700 Kelvin all the way up to 4000 Kelvin, which is getting close to sunlight. A color rendering index of 90, which means it faithfully reproduces colors, and there's less color shift when using this light. These are dimmable, and like I said, with these tracks you can put a number of these fixtures. At 14.8 watts, it's pretty small. So your lighting circuits can support a lot of these, and so can your tracks. The other sort of light I was looking at is basically what I have in the space right now, which is an LED troffer, kind of mimics a 4-foot fluorescent, the old style. This one here, specifically the halo fixture, it's 4600 lumen output, and it's meant to be a replacement for fluorescent. Some other sort of things here is that it can be dimmed, but it's pretty simple. LED, these tend to be that you can get them in a couple of different color temperatures. Mine that I have in my space now, you can actually, there's a switch, you can change the color temperature, basically warm to cool. So using these two basic fixture types, what's interesting again about Revit is I can pull in the data and do a couple different options. So let me take you here, I'll just show you. This is the 3D model that has been built in Revit, and it's very similar to SketchUp. Again, we have a room within a room. We have our shady spy government agent here and another drum kit in here just to give a bit of context. And now we're going to look at the reflected ceiling plan. And this, if you're not familiar with that term, that means that I am inside the room and I'm looking up. So I kind of started, my first base case was track lighting. The idea that I would just put a bunch of track lighting across the sides of this space. And what I did is I set this up, I put in the manufacturer's data, and I did some rendering. So let me pull some of that up. So this is my drum space with creepy space or spy here, the drum. And this is with the track lights that were laid out in that first base case. And what you can see is, it gives you kind of an idea of what it would look like. This is kind of an interesting look. I mean, it's more like a museum. There's a lot of light very close to the walls, probably not desirable. Here's the back sort of view behind the drum kit. And you can see, obviously, there's very bright lights across spots across the walls there. But what's also interesting about Revit is, and I won't go into any details here in terms of Revit or how it works and those sort of things, but what it lets you do is do some photometric analysis. So what this is showing you, and it kind of looks like one of those infrared, like a heat gun. It's similar, but on these color code here is foot candles. And foot candle is sort of an even amount of lumens across a square foot, and it's used to judge the quantity of light at a workspace or a wall or a floor. And I'll show you briefly the Illuminating Engineering Society has recommendations, and this is a little bit different. Obviously we're working in a drum room, which is like an art space. You could be pitch black in there and you'd probably be fine, depending on how you're using it. But this is, some context, so for commercial kind of offices, 30 to 50 foot candles probably at the work surface. Yeah, so at 30 inches above finished floor. You're looking at a classroom, it's similar, 30 to 50. In a gymnasium, you actually want it brighter, so 125. A couple of different things here. There's no other in here that says drum practice room or music studio or anything like that. But if we look here, and this sort of photometric or illuminance diagram ranges from 0 to 200 foot candles, and it caps out at 200. So this actually might be more than 200. It goes yellow, caps out. But it's indicative of what you were seeing in the general image here. You've got a giant spot on the wall, that's above 200 foot candles. And then at the floor level, you're dipping down into 20, 30, 40. I mean, you might be okay, if you were to judge it against, say, an office or something. But what I think this kind of highlights, it's intuitive, and you can see it in the previous image, is there's just giant spots and then a bright light and then dark sort of situation. And so, that's great. This tool, you can test things. What's also good about Revit is you can set up design options. So here I have the main model. And I can actually, these are track heads that are essentially 4 foot on center along the length. I could say, okay, well now I'm going to only do, let's do 8 foot on center. So this is 3 spots in the space. So if I went and looked at that, okay, you know, it's a little bit different in terms of just general rendering or what we think it would look like. You still have some dark spaces, and granted, these heads can be moved anywhere. You got some heads washing the corners and some spots there. From the other end, same thing, where you can see here visually it's a little dark, but then you got some bright spots. You know, if you were shining the light on a museum piece, maybe that would be good. But the lighting in the space is very, it has a wide range, very bright to kind of dark. But if you're into that, maybe that's what you'd like. And that's what's indicative here. So we obviously took a few fixtures out. That's dropped the areas of brightness. The overall illumination in the space, you know, it's kind of down towards the bottom, you know. Again, you can move these heads around and do it however you want, but this is sort of track lighting, spot lighting. You have a very intense area. There is some reflectivity off the wall materials and the floor materials, but in general, you got sort of bright and dark in this type of arrangement. And this time what we're going to do is we brought in those surface-mounted linear LEDs. And in this arrangement, what I did is put a couple of track lights, and you know, you can imagine this as being a long track and then having a couple of fixtures at each end to kind of splash the corners, and then you just have some general lighting here. So if we take a look at what that looks like, you know, obviously you can see with these linear lights, there's a lot more ambient light, and then you sort of had the spotlights flooding the corners. And again, these heads could be moved, so maybe that's, you know, you could put some artwork up if you're feeling really froggy. The reverse angle here, looking in behind the kit, there's a lot more light overhead to work with. So as we thought, you know, there's a lot more illuminance throughout the space in general. You're pushing up into the sort of ones, the red here, the 140, 160 foot candles. It's you know, it's above even the high one for the gym, so it's quite bright in here. And then you have those intense areas in the corners. So that may or may not be desirable. And if we go back to Revit, I thought, well, what if we just got rid of those track lights and we just use, this is basically the setup I have in my drum room now, although I do have a small, they call it a type or a screw-in type bulb here, a little LED bulb. So if we take a look at that, you know, it's a little bit more even lit. This kind of feels like my room now in terms of aesthetics. And back here, so it's a very even, you know, you don't have those bright intense spots, the dark shadow, the bright spots with the shadow spots. And when you look at the photometrics here, you know, it's at the ceiling is probably the lowest. These are shadows beneath the different items, but for the most part, everything's pretty well lit. I mean, there's a lot of light in there, which for a room like this, you may want, you may not want, and that's where it kind of gets back to vibe and those sort of pieces. So maybe I'll look at another case that I looked at. This is one where I thought, you know what, this space is relatively small in sort of the north-south direction. What if I, instead of having the big linear troughers, and instead of having the track lighting so close to the wall, what if I just put it in the center, and then I just did some random aiming to kind of even it out a little bit, just for fun to see what would it look like. And that's what created this, very moody. Look how moody this guy is. So, you know, I think it's a little more diffuse in terms of having the track lights in the middle and then going out rather than being on the edges and being so close to the walls. It could be, I mean, for some people that might be what they like, a little ambiance, a little bit of mood lighting in here. And you could actually set this up so maybe these are on 2 to 3 linear tracks, and those could be switched separately. And then you could go hog wild with different scenes you want to set up. And so when we look at the photometrics, it's kind of what we thought. So obviously where these track lights are aiming is where the intense light is going to be. We do get some reflection off of some of these materials. And you're kind of down in the blue again. You got some dark spots and then some very intense spots where that's located. And then one of the last case was, again, I wasn't quite giving up on track lights. I was just kind of fooling around with this and thought, well, what if I kind of did a T shape where there was a long track here with 2 or maybe even 3 lights, and then another linear track over here with 3 lights. And just thought, I called this the drummer spotlight, because these are 3 lights. You know, if the kit was right here, they would all be aiming at the drummer. Let's see what that looks like. So it's, I don't know, it looks kind of cool, right? Look at this. This is pretty intense over here in terms of the drummer being lit. And that might be, you know, in this space I will do some filming, and this might be good to have a track light over here because you instantly have a hair light, or, you know, in terms of your 3-point lighting approach. You have a way to kind of light the hair, or and there's our brooding agent. You know, I kind of like it. You know, it's interesting. There's a lot of light over here. It's a little less clinical than the big linear fixtures. Adds a little ambiance, but it may, or there is some flexibility here, obviously, in any of the track lighting arrangements. Heads can be rotated or moved. So as you've seen, you know, by kind of aiming things around, you do get a little bit more spill. This is kind of your central area over by the drummer. And then obviously wherever these other guys, in terms of track lighting, wherever they aim, they're going to be nailing some high illuminance and then some dark spots where you kind of fall into the shadows in some of those areas. So that's a list of different things that I looked at. You know, track lighting with different spacing of heads, aiming the track lighting at different parts of the room, using some surface lighting, some troffers, or linear fixtures, mixing that with track lighting, or just having the linear fixtures, also kind of adjusting the layout of the tracks, as well as this last one here, which is a bit indulgent in this space if you want to feel like you're on stage. I'm not totally decided on how I'm going to do this. But I think the key here in terms of design and planning is that I've decided not to pursue recessed lighting. And I don't want to do anything too complicated, like try to put in crown molding and linear LED above the crown molding, or putting in a soffit, which is basically a lowered section of the ceiling, and then using that to do a recessed lighting. It's just, there isn't a lot of headroom in here. You lose a little bit of headroom because of the ceiling, the second ceiling. And I just want to keep it relatively simple. So I'm not completely decided, but if you have some ideas or some thoughts, feel free to share them in the comments. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little brief discussion about lighting, lighting design, layout, some of the topics. You know, I think it's interesting talking about lighting because it really is one of those subjects that kind of goes beyond, you know, how do I do this one thing? It becomes very subjective. There are 1,000 different ways to skin the cat. And so it can be a little challenge in kind of coming up with what you want to do. Obviously, in terms of your build, you know, you may approach that by just having some fixtures and doing some base level lighting, and then relying on small supplementary things or kind of more aesthetic lighting, like some LEDs, lamps, those sort of things, to kind of give you kind of more of the vibe or the feel that you're going for. I think for my design, I'm kind of, it's a little bit more pragmatic. I'm not as concerned with the sort of lighting aesthetic. I say that now. We'll see what happens once we get it in there, or whether or not I'm changing anything. But at least here, hopefully that gives you at least some of the basic concepts and some ideas and some of the tools that you can use to sort of visualize what your space is going to look like and make some of your choices. Thanks for watching.